It is June 22nd, 1940, and the sun is rising over the New Forest in Hampshire. The morning light filters through the dense canopy of ancient oaks and beeches, casting long shadows across the woodland floor. A small convoy of military lorries winds through the narrow forest tracks, their engines straining against the muddy terrain. The soldiers aboard are quiet, watching the trees as though expecting them to suddenly move. They are not afraid of the wood itself, but of what is about to happen within it. Major Edmund Bartley stands at the edge of a clearing, his map case tucked under his arm, studying the forest with the intensity of a man who has been given an impossible task. Around him, teams of sappers are unloading crates from the vehicles. Inside those crates are thousands of anti-tank obstacles, each one deliberately designed to transform this peaceful woodland into a killing ground. Within 48 hours, this forest, one of England's most ancient and cherished landscapes, will become something entirely different. It will become a trap. For the men working that morning, there was no sense of historical significance. They were focused on the immediate, practical work at hand. But what they were constructing would become one of the most extensive and elaborate anti-invasion defenses ever built on British soil. It represented a moment of profound national anxiety, a physical manifestation of Britain's fear that German invasion was not merely possible, it was probable. And if that invasion came, this forest and hundreds of others would become the front line of a desperate last stand. The story of how an entire nation, expecting invasion within weeks, transformed its landscape into a vast military machine is largely forgotten today. The obstacles remain in some places, half-buried and overgrown, their original purpose obscured by decades of woodland growth. But they tell a story worth recovering, a story about engineering under pressure, about improvisation born from desperation, and about a country preparing to fight a war on its own soil. By June 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The German Wehrmacht had overrun continental Europe with terrifying speed and efficiency. And now, across the Channel, German forces were preparing for Operation Seelöwe, the invasion of Britain itself. It was not a question of if the Germans would come. Most British military planners believed, but when? Intelligence suggested an invasion could be launched within weeks. The government began preparing for the worst. The British Army had been catastrophically depleted by the evacuation from Dunkirk 3 weeks earlier. Returning soldiers had lost virtually all their heavy equipment. The forces remaining in Britain were undermanned, under-equipped, and desperately short of the weapons needed to repel an amphibious invasion. There were, by some estimates, fewer than 100 serviceable tanks in the entire country. Anti-tank guns were scarce. Artillery was scattered. The Royal Air Force was being ground down in the Battle of Britain. If German forces landed, the army would have to defeat them with whatever could be improvised, repurposed, or hastily manufactured. The invasion threat focused military planners' minds on a single strategic problem. How do you stop a modern mechanized army from advancing through your own countryside? The traditional answer, pitched battles between armies on open ground, was impossible. Germany's panzer divisions had demonstrated that in France. The answer had to be different. It had to be about denial of space, about forcing the invader to slow down, to scatter, to be vulnerable to counterattack. And that meant obstacles. In June 1940, the War Office issued instructions that would set off one of the largest engineering projects in British military history. The coastline and the major approach routes into southern England would be fortified with anti-tank obstacles. These would not be the graceful fortifications of the Great War, the trenches and barbed wire that defined an earlier generation of warfare. These would be brutal, geometric, and modern. They would be designed to rip the undercarriage from German tanks and force their infantry to deploy on foot, where they could be engaged by rifle and machine gun fire. The scale of the problem was staggering. Britain's coastlines total roughly 2,400 kilometers. The major invasion beaches and landing zones stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Even with unlimited resources and unlimited time, it would have been difficult to fortify every potential landing site. But resources were not unlimited, and time was measured in weeks. The solution had to be to focus effort on the likeliest invasion corridors, the flat beaches and harbors of southern England, particularly the coast from Sussex to Norfolk, where landing craft could most easily make landfall. Yet the coastal defense was only part of the strategy. The real ingenuity lay in what the military called stop lines, lines of obstacles and fortifications designed to be positioned inland, along roads and through forests, to prevent rapid mechanized advance once the Germans had established a beachhead. If the invasion could not be stopped at the water's edge, it had to be stopped inland, and that required defending the landscape itself. The New Forest presented a particular problem. The ancient woodland stretched across thousands of acres of Hampshire. Its narrow tracks and dense undergrowth made it an obvious defensive position. But it also presented clear dangers. A forest, if properly prepared, could become impenetrable to motorized vehicles. But it could also become a place where an invader might hide, regroup, and launch attacks from concealment. The decision was made to transform it, to make it impassable to German vehicles whilst maintaining routes for British defenders. The obstacles themselves came in several distinct designs, each optimized for a specific purpose. The most famous, and the type that would have caused the most visible transformation to the forest, were the concrete or wooden anti-tank blocks. These were crude, brutal devices, rectangular concrete pyramids, typically about 60 centimeters, 2 feet, tall, weighing approximately 1 ton each. When placed in staggered rows across a roadway or clearing, they formed an impenetrable barrier to any tank or lorry. A vehicle attempting to cross would find its undercarriage hooked by the blocks, tearing it apart. But concrete blocks required factories, cement, and transport. In the summer of 1940, British industry was struggling to keep up with demand for weapons. The answer, increasingly, was improvisation. Sappers began constructing obstacles from materials that were readily available. In forests, they used stone. In coastal areas, they used concrete when it could be obtained. Where nothing else was available, they used timber. The timber obstacles were particularly effective in forested terrain. Teams of sappers would fell trees and arrange them into tangles of sharpened branches, creating abattis, a word borrowed from 18th century fortification terminology. The logs were positioned at angles, with branches sharpened to stake-like points, creating a barrier that would snag tracked vehicles and puncture tires of wheeled ones. These obstacles required only axes, saws, and manpower. By the summer of 1940, manpower was increasingly available as civilian men were mobilized into the Home Guard and Engineering Corps. The manufacturing and installation of anti-tank obstacles became a national effort. By August 1940, War Office records show that approximately 200,000 concrete and steel obstacles had been installed around Britain's coastlines and major approach routes. The true figure, including timber obstacles and improvised defenses, was certainly much higher. In the forests alone, sappers and Home Guard volunteers constructed obstacles over hundreds of kilometers of potential approach routes. In the New Forest specifically, records from the time suggest that over 15 kilometers of continuous obstacle lines were constructed through the woodland and along major forest roads. The work was carried out in near-complete secrecy. Civilians living in the areas where obstacles were being installed were often given no explanation for the work. They simply woke one morning to find their local forest transformed. Roads that had been passable for centuries were suddenly blocked. Familiar clearings were filled with concrete blocks or timber tangles. The landscape was being weaponized in front of their eyes. The construction process itself was remarkably efficient, given the circumstances. Teams of sappers would survey the forest routes to identify the narrowest points where vehicles could be forced to bunch up. These choke points would then be selected for the heaviest concentration of obstacles. Sappers would clear vegetation, position the anti-tank blocks in carefully calculated staggered patterns, and sometimes augment them with smaller anti-personnel mines or booby traps designed to injure infantry attempting to clear the obstacles by hand. The psychology of the operation was as important as the physics. The British military understood that the obstacles served a dual purpose. Physically, they would slow advancing vehicles and force them to halt, but psychologically, they would send a message. This landscape is hostile. Every meter of ground has been prepared for your destruction. There is no route forward that does not pass through a minefield of obstacles. For an invading force, this would be psychologically devastating. But for the British defenders, the obstacles represented hope. They represented preparation. They represented a fighting chance. By late 1940, the invasion threat was receding. The German Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority in the Battle of Britain. Hitler, facing the unexpected resilience of British resistance and the reality that invasion could only succeed if Germany controlled the air, began shifting his strategic focus towards the Soviet Union. Operation Selova was postponed, then quietly abandoned. The invasion would not come, yet the obstacles remained in place for years. During the remainder of the war, the anti-tank defenses served a different purpose. They became a training ground. Soldiers approaching D-Day and subsequent operations in continental Europe trained on them, learning how to navigate defended terrain. Sappers practiced clearing obstacles under fire. Infantry learned the tactics required to assault fortified positions. The defenses that had been built to repel invasion became a school for invasion. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. More stories from Britain's forgotten military projects are coming soon. The question of how effective these obstacles would have been against actual German invasion has been debated ever since. German military planners certainly took them seriously. After the war, captured German officers stated that they had been given intelligence reports on the scale of British anti-invasion defenses, and that the obstacle lines had been factored into their assessment of whether invasion was feasible. Some accounts suggest that the density and extent of the defenses, combined with the German failure to achieve air superiority, made invasion appear prohibitively difficult to German high command. Yet the evidence is ambiguous. The obstacles would have slowed German mechanized forces, certainly. They would have forced regrouping and disrupted momentum. But whether they would have been sufficient to repel invasion entirely remains unknowable, because the invasion never happened. Military historians have conducted various analyses, some suggesting that determined German forces with engineering support could have cleared the obstacles relatively quickly, others arguing that the obstacles would have imposed unacceptable delays and casualties. The truth, almost certainly, lies somewhere between these extremes. What can be said with certainty is that the obstacles represented something significant about British strategy and psychology in 1940. They represented a refusal to surrender. They represented a nation preparing to defend itself by transforming its own landscape into a weapon. When the invasion threat passed, the obstacles remained as monuments to that moment of preparation. They are still there, in fact, though most people no longer recognize them for what they are. Scattered through forests and along old roads throughout southern England, decades of overgrowth have concealed the anti-tank obstacles. Most modern visitors to the New Forest have no idea they are walking past weapons designed to destroy German tanks. The German equivalent defenses, by comparison, were far more elaborate and more durable. German planners, once they decided to invade the Soviet Union, invested enormous resources in fortifying the Atlantic Wall, the system of coastal defenses stretching from France to Norway. These defenses were far more sophisticated than the British obstacles. They included reinforced concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and wire obstacles, all coordinated into a comprehensive defensive system. Yet the Atlantic Wall ultimately failed. When the Allies invaded Normandy in 1944, they overcame the defenses through overwhelming force, careful planning, and air superiority. The comparison suggests that obstacles alone, however well prepared, cannot stop a determined invasion force if that force possesses air superiority and numerical advantage. The American approach to anti-invasion defense was broadly similar to the British, but with greater resources and more systematic implementation. American coastal defenses in the Pacific, designed to repel Japanese invasion, were if anything more extensive than the British obstacles. These included elaborate networks of beach obstacles, anti-tank gun positions, and inland fortifications. Like the British defenses, they succeeded not because they would have been impenetrable, but because they were never seriously tested against actual invasion. What distinguishes the British effort is not its greater effectiveness or sophistication, but its speed and the sense of desperation that drove it. The obstacles were built by a nation expecting invasion within weeks. They were built without certainty about their effectiveness. They were built because doing something felt better than doing nothing. And that very urgency, that very rawness of the preparation, gives them a particular historical significance. They represent a moment when Britain stood alone, when the future was genuinely uncertain, and when every resource, human and material, was mobilized for survival. The broader legacy of these defenses extends beyond their direct military impact. The obstacle lines influence the development of post-war fortification theory. Military planners studied how obstacles and anti-tank defenses could be integrated into broader defensive strategies. The experience of constructing and training with the obstacles provided lessons that influenced British military doctrine throughout the Cold War. When Britain later constructed defenses against potential Soviet invasion, though those defenses would never be tested, they incorporated lessons learned from the 1940 anti-invasion program. The obstacles also left a lasting mark on the British landscape. Many were never fully removed after the war. In some locations, local authorities built roads around them rather than going to the trouble of demolishing them. In forests, they were simply left to be overgrown by vegetation. Today, archaeological surveys of forests like the New Forest reveal extensive networks of anti-tank obstacles still present beneath the woodland canopy. They have become archaeological artifacts, evidence of a moment in British history when total war seemed imminent. For modern visitors to these forests, the obstacles offer a tangible connection to a specific, vivid moment in British history. They are not museum pieces behind glass, but physical objects embedded in the landscape where they were originally placed. Walking through a forest and suddenly encountering a concrete anti-tank block, partially covered by moss and tree roots, creates a visceral connection to the past. It is a way of understanding, at a fundamental level, what it meant for Britain to prepare for invasion. It is a way of feeling the anxiety and determination of that moment. The forests themselves have changed dramatically in the 80 years since the obstacles were installed. The New Forest today is not the same forest that existed in 1940. Many of the trees that were there then have been felled or have died. New growth has covered the clearings where sappers once worked. The forest roads have been rebuilt and realigned. Yet the obstacles remain, largely unchanged, bearing silent witness to a moment when this landscape was transformed into a weapon. This was the paradox of Britain's anti-invasion defenses. They were designed to prevent a future that never came. They were built at enormous cost in effort and resources to stop an invasion that would never happen. Had the invasion come, they might have been instrumental in repelling it. Or they might have been quickly overcome by determined German forces. History did not provide the test. Instead, the obstacles became monuments to a moment of preparation, reminders of a time when Britain stood alone and prepared to fight the last battle of the Second World War on its own soil. The forgotten missions that constructed these defenses deserve recognition. Thousands of soldiers, engineers, and civilian volunteers worked through the summer and autumn of 1940 to transform Britain's landscape. They worked without knowing whether their efforts would be sufficient. They worked with incomplete information and inadequate resources. They worked because their country was facing an existential threat, and doing nothing was unacceptable. The obstacles that remain in Britain's forests today are their legacy. When you walk through a forest and see a strange concrete block half buried in the earth, or encounter a tangle of old logs with sharpened branches, you are looking at this history. You are looking at the physical manifestation of a nation's fear and determination in its darkest hour. You are looking at weapons designed 80 years ago to defend a nation that stood alone against the Nazi war machine. The obstacles remain largely forgotten by the public, overlooked by most visitors, but they are still there, silent, patient, waiting for the invasion that never came.